Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Harun Chaudhary. I'm Acting Associate Vice President International at the University of Regina. I would like to acknowledge first that the University of Regina is situated on Treaty 4 land with presence in Treaty 6. These are the territories of Nehowak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. It is very nice to meet with each and every one of you today in person and virtually. I am pleased to announce that today's event is organized by our wonderful UR International Global Training Initiative team with partnership with our Department of Psychology. The University of Regina became the part of the Fulbright Chairs program in 2017, and since then it has proudly fostered a total of 5 Fulbright Canada Research Chairs. The foundation of the educational exchange between the Canada and the United States of America, aka Fulbright Canada, is a binational, treaty-based, non-governmental, not-for-profit organization with a mandate to identify the best and brightest minds in both countries and engage them in residential academic exchange. The mandate of the Fulbright Canada is to enhance mutual understanding between the people of Canada and the people of the United States of America by providing support to outstanding individuals. Currently, the University of Regina is fostering 3 Fulbright scholars, 2 in the areas of environmental studies, hosted by University of Regina, and Dr. Delos Ray, hosted by the Department of Psychology, Faculty of Arts. Today, we are happy to welcome Dr. Anders Delos Ray, Fulbright Canada Chair in Mental Health. It is now with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Gordon Asomanthan, Professor, Department of Psychology, to speak. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Thank you for the introduction and welcome everybody. It's really my pleasure to welcome everybody on behalf of the Department of Psychology and our colloquium series chair, Dr. Thomas Hadjistavropoulos, who I hope is joining us virtually, and also UR International. Welcome for those of you who are here in person. I do see some dignitaries in the audience that I will mention. We have Dr. Jeff Laux, the chair of the Department of Psychology. We have Dr. Chris Oriet, who is a associate dean in the Faculty of Grad Studies and Research, and we have Dr. Shannon D, our dean in Faculty of Arts. So welcome to you, welcome everybody, and welcome to all of those of you online. Before I introduce our esteemed guest, there are a couple of housekeeping duties that I've been asked to mention. One is, as you might guess, this meeting is being recorded. Secondly, if you have questions, for those of you who are with us online, there is a Q&A box, and we ask that you enter your questions in the Q&A box, and those will be addressed after the presentation. For those of you in person with us here, we ask that you stand up with your questions at the end of the presentation. Now, I have the great honor and privilege of introducing our esteemed guest, Dr. Andy de Loreas, my friend and my collaborator, who is spending some time here with us at the University of Regina. I sat down last night thinking about a few things that I might share with you to introduce Dr. de Loreas. And, you know, I jotted a few things down. He's very accomplished. And, how much time do we have? I'll give you 5 minutes at the end to present. Just kidding. I'll be very brief. Dr. De La Reyes received his doctorate from Yale University in 2008, and from Yale went directly to the University of Maryland, where he is a professor, now a full professor in the Department of Psychology. He is the author of the Early Career Researchers Toolbox, which some of you are familiar with because we shared that with you in our graduate training class. It's a very important contribution for those just starting their academic careers. He's the author of, as of this morning, 129 peer-reviewed research papers. He's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology. He's the recipient of many, many early career awards, including every early career award available from the American Psychological Association. And he's a world-renowned expert in multi-informant approaches to assessment. And that's the foundation of some of the work that he's doing here with us at the University of Regina over the 4-month tenure. So, most importantly for today, he is a Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Mental Health here at the University of Regina. And with that, I welcome Dr. Andy De La Reyes.
Thank you so much for a couple of delightful introductions, and thank you all for sharing the next hour with me, where I'll talk about some of the work we've been doing over the last 20 years on how we assess children. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that the work that we do in this space isn't possible without a strong network of collaborators across various disciplines, various content areas, and it's a joy thinking about the things that we're discussing with you today with all of them and with my colleagues here at the University of Regina. I thought I'd start today pretty broad, and I wanted to ask those of you here and those of you in the audience, think back to a time in the not too distant past where you had to make a decision and you couldn't make it all by yourself. At least one other person needed to be involved. And just think about something like that. It could be as broad, it could be something happening at work or at home. And for many of us, we might have thought to ourselves, well, maybe the last time we had to think about where to go out to eat or what to watch on Netflix over the weekend. And in all likelihood, so long as the person you're making a decision with didn't come to a decision solely to make you upset. They chose sushi because you don't like sushi. They decided, let's watch Don't Look Up because you don't believe in climate change, or asteroids, or you don't like Meryl Streep. Just so long as you're as the decision point was a legitimate one, that there's a good reason for why you decided the thing you wanted to decide upon. This is the kind of things ubiquitous to social experience, to human life. We have to make decisions, and oftentimes we're not on the same page with the other person involved in the decision. Now that happens in day-to-day life, but it also happens when we figure out, is that education program working? Well, the outcome of that decision likely depends on how you measure progress in that program and judge its effectiveness. We might come to discrepant views on the way we raise our children, right? The way we decide, hey, you know, who takes out the garbage on Thursday, or what should curfew be set for Jane now that she's in sophomore year in high school. These discrepancies are also structural. So in common law countries, when we settle a legal dispute, ironically, we create a dispute in a courtroom using this adversarial system. And so a key premise of the work that I do is that there are a variety of circumstances where we often see things differently on really important elements of social experiences. And when we embrace those discrepancies, when we understand that the space between seeing things oftentimes creates learning opportunities, well, we might be able to optimize decision making. But in a variety of different social circumstances and in circumstances with regards to research, discrepant views often compel us to think, well, if we're seeing things differently, then who's right? Who's wrong? What's the deal with this discrepancy? Is there no legitimate reason for its occurrence, but rather it's a function of some kind of aspect of imprecision or somebody's just plain wrong? So if you were to boil down the work that we do in my research team, it focuses on this very broad question of why do people see the same social experiences in different ways? And related to that question, poses another question: is there a way to find circumstances where these discrepant views actually become learning opportunities and actually become tools for making decisions and to optimize decision making, rather than thinking that it's a place for conflict to occur? I do a lot of this work, as Gordon mentioned, in the context of assessing youth mental health. And there are a variety of really good reasons for that that I'll open to the talk, but I want to illustrate how these discrepant views will manifest when we try to get a sense of the mental health status of a single person. When we assess a child or adolescent, we want to get a sense of what their needs are for mental health services. We won't just ask them a bunch of questions about how they're thinking and feeling and behaving. We're going to ask the same kinds of questions to significant others in their lives, like parents and teachers. A lot of the work that I do is in the context of assessing a pretty difficult process to understand, anxiety, and in particular anxiety that one experiences when they encounter unfamiliar situations, right? Really intense fear, really intense avoidance of those situations. We assess adolescence, and in our group, when we assess any one adolescent, well, we might come to the conclusion that that adolescent has experiences intense fears and impairments when they're in high performance situations where there's a lot on the line, but also really clear rules of engagement. Giving a speech, I know I should make eye contact, I know I should enunciate, I know I should speak a little bit slower than usual. That adolescent actually might work out quite fine interpersonally with other people, because particularly in those situations where the audience shrinks from lots of people to just one person and the rules of engagement are still there. We might have another adolescent who comes into our clinic that actually shows the opposite kind of pattern, where they're in an audience, but it's an audience, so I don't really have to attend any one person in the room. I don't have to make eye contact here. I can distract myself. I can look this way, and actually I can make that situation go okay. But when you shrink that audience down to one person and they can't do that, that's where their symptoms and impairment show. And still, I might have another adolescent who comes into our evaluative studies, and they actually do okay in both of these scenarios because there are rules of engagement. Very clear, enunciate, eye contact, all those things. And where their symptoms and impairment shows when you strip the social experience of all those rules of engagement. They're in a much more unstructured scenario, and it's really hard to navigate those and understand what's effective. How do I make friends and influence people when I'm at a party? All three of those adolescents who may be experiencing social anxiety might nonetheless function just fine when they're with familiar people like their friends. And in a lot of the work that we do, we sort of ask the very broad question: if I were to put a person in each of those scenarios for any one of these adolescents we're assessing, a parent in the home scenario, a teacher in another scenario, a peer in the neighborhood, and we ask the adolescents themselves a bunch of questions, should we expect the same responses from all those people? Their social experiences are fundamentally different. Anxiety is different, those people are different, from scenario to scenario to scenario. I mean, have any of us ever met an adolescent who behaves the exact same way at home, with their friends at school? No, there's a lot of consensus in this space when we think about discrepant views and in a host of other spaces where we know that people behave uniquely depending on where they are. And the struggle in the context of the research that we do is in trying to reconcile that unique variation among the individuals with this notion that when it comes to data, when we try to put numbers in those behaviors, we're all conditioned to say to ourselves, I know I'm on the right track when all these data are telling us the same thing. And that's no accident. In psychology, you can trace the origin story of that idea that convergence equals truth down to the very start of the discipline, down to back where Edgeworth took principles of physics back in the late 1800s and repurposed them for assessing mental states. And the question is, under what circumstances is that a proper application of basic principles from another discipline to our discipline? And so over the course of the remainder of the talk, I'm going to go through a few different points. I'm going to talk a bit about, well, how often do these discrepant views manifest in assessments of youth mental health? I'm then going to talk a bit about, well, what do they actually reflect when they occur? Are there ways of optimizing the interpretability or accuracy of the interpretability of those assessments? And then I'll give you a sense of the kinds of steps in research that I'm really excited about that I hope to pursue over the next 5 or 10 years. And when I give talks like this, when the audience is as broad as it is, I really like it when my audience members are selfish. And at some point I'll talk about something from our own group. I hope your mind trails off and thinks to yourself, well, how does that apply to the work that I do? Because if I give you an idea, I'd like to hear it. Send me an email and we can set up a chat. There's still a couple months left of my tenure here at the university. I'm hoping to have some really fun conversations along here. Okay, so how often do these discrepant views occur in assessments in youth mental health? One of the reasons why I enjoy studying this really broad topic in this specific area is that, like in a lot of models of scholarly inquiry, it's a great place for the phenomenon I care about happens. The effects you see in work on these issues as it manifests in youth mental health are as robust as placebo effects. Really strong effects. I'll give you an illustration. So, let's see, about 30 years ago, that was a really influential meta-analysis, now cited thousands of times in the late 1980s. And the team, really prominent team led by Thomas Achenbach, asked a question of a bunch of different studies that have been published over the last few decades. On average, how large of a relationship should we expect to see from different information sources like parents and teachers and kids rating the same target person, rating the same child? And when they computed a simple statistic that all of us use, a correlation statistic, where 0 means no agreement, 1 means perfect agreement, we see that on average, that correlation is pretty low. It's a pretty low level of agreement among different information sources rating the same person. About 25 years after that meta-analysis, we conducted one of our own that basically had the same kind of aim, only we judged and rated up a completely different study set, completely independent of the last meta-analysis. And you know, one of the things we were surprised by, I want to show you the figure, is this idea that so much changed over those 25 years of research on youth mental health. The theories that guide our work changed. A great deal of the treatments that we administered to children changed. Lots of things changed over the course of that 25 years. And the one thing that didn't was this level of correspondence. Exactly the same. Now you might say to yourself, well, is the stability a function of how similar the samples were? Maybe all of the children assessed in all the samples all came from North America. Well, a few years later, we addressed that question. To what degree is the stability simply a function of very similar studies on very similar samples? And the answer is these samples couldn't be more different from each other. This kind of question has been addressed in studies all over the planet, 30 countries, every inhabited continent, and the level of precision in our ability to estimate this level of correspondence, maybe it wouldn't be the kind of thing that a physicist would be happy with, but it sure as heck is something that I'm very happy with. Very stable effect, especially for the social sciences. So we know it's there, we know it's stable, we can set our watch to it. So what does it mean? Now, to answer the question of what these discrepant views mean, at least in the context of assessing children, it's important to understand how psychology generally thinks about data, particularly when you're looking at a bunch of different pieces of data about the same thing. We can credit how many of us think about data back to a very influential psychophysicist back in the 1940s and 50s, right at the advent of the cognitive revolution in psychology that gave rise to a very influential subdiscipline of our discipline called cognitive science. Wendell Garner studied the links between physical properties and subjective states. So an example of a study of his might be, I want to see or understand the degree to which a human being can accurately estimate weights on their hands and figure out which one's heavier than the other, whether do they weigh similarly. And what was really important, a really important element of that work is that tying physical properties to mental states is a really tough endeavor. You can't rely just on one experiment or two or three or four. And so what Wendell Garner did that was so influential for all of psychology was to ask, well, if I can't draw much certainty from one experiment, I'm going to design a bunch of different experiments, all tapping into or helping me address the same hypothesis. And the degree to which those different experiences point to the same conclusion should give me an extra confidence that the hypothesis I'm testing was correct and is an accurate reflection of the phenomenon I'm trying to assess. So in that circumstance, convergence is truth. And why shouldn't it be? Well, particularly if you're walking into a scenario where you're saying to yourself, if I'm wrong, I want at least one of these experiments to scream back at me, wrong, null effect, not accurate state of affairs. And this is a great model for when you should expect convergence to equal truth, because convergence happens often. But I just showed you several decades of data that indicate that that is not what we should be expecting when we assess children. We should not be expecting convergence to equal truth, because otherwise, I guess we could assume that all of our instruments are terrible. They're imprecise, they're not useful, and perhaps youth mental health research has been wasting their time for the last 60 or 70 years. I tend to think that maybe our instruments are actually on the right track. And perhaps one of the reasons why we're seeing these discrepant views is because they're accurately reflecting the fact that children vary depending on how children behave differently depending on where they are. And we're like journalists. We select information sources precisely because they're in really good positions to give us useful information about the kids we're assessing. So a lot of the work that we do tries to go beyond this model and ask the basic question, might there be some circumstances where these discrepant reviews reflect real phenomena? I'm going to give you a few examples of how we tackled this question. One of the first sort of focus tests of this question, this idea of these discrepant reviews tell us something useful of behavior, was done about 15 years ago now. And we assessed a phenomenon that occurs often in clinical situations when we're assessing the disruptive behavior of young children. So children who, above and beyond just telling their mom no and throwing a fit now and then, it's really persistent, pervasive, impairing, disruptive to the family relationship, disruptive to the child's functioning. This kind of disruptive behavior that happens in young children that goes way above and beyond normative levels. When we assess children for these kinds of issues, we often will solicit the input of the parent, but also a non-parental caregiver, like a daycare teacher or somebody in preschool. And this is one place too where discrepant reviews, as you might suspect, often happen. But nonetheless, clinically, we oftentimes are crossing our fingers that we can treat parents' reports as a proxy for what's happening at the home, and teachers' reports as a proxy for what's happening at school or in a non-home setting. But up until this point, there hadn't been any focused tests of this question, in part because it's really hard to figure out, well, I have a teacher report, I have a parent report, so who's the referee? Who's the referee? Well, it turns out that we had access to a data set that had a built-in referee in it. And it was this really great laboratory task where children came into the office and they were administered a series of activities. They were asked to play for a little bit, and then at the tail end of the play session, the caregiver they're interacting with asked them, pick up your toys, Johnny. There were some interactions that involved the child playing by themselves on their own while the caregiver wasn't attending to them. So several different activities that pressed for the opportunity for a child to display disruptive behavior. And the elegance of this task wasn't developed by me, so I can say that it's a brilliant task. The elegance behind this task is that each of those activities were structured or parallel across different interactions between the child and their parent, and the child and an unfamiliar examiner, somebody who could stand in as a proxy for a non-parental adult. So because of that structure, you could then determine, is this child behaving disruptively with just one of these authority figures, or the other, or both, or neither? And then we can ask the question, a twofold question. To what degree do children actually display individual differences in the context where they behave disruptively? And do parents and teachers' patterns of reports match or track that laboratory task? So we carried out an analysis that allowed us to look at subgroups of kids in this data set of roughly 300 children. And these children sort of basically fleshed out into 4 different groups. That top group, that red group, was a group of kids that had a high probability of behaving disruptively with everyone, with all the authority figures with whom they interacted. That blue group is a group that displayed disruptive behavior only with that non-parental adult, only with that unfamiliar examiner. That green group was a group that showed a high probability of behaving disruptively with their parent, but not the unfamiliar examiner. And that group at the bottom, the orange group, the really good kids were the ones who showed a very low probability of disruptive behavior across all the interactions. So they flesh out, it's what we'd expect in a sample of children that vary considerably in the nature and patterning of their behavior. Now, the interesting thing is that when you change the definition of who's allowed to say this child's disruptive, so the parent but not the examiner but not the parent, the ability of those groups to be distinguished from the orange group changes. So in this circumstance, not only the parent was endorsing disruptive behavior, but not the teacher. That green group that gets differentiated from the orange group, but not the other group, not the blue group. That finding flips when the endorsement comes from the teacher and not the parent, right? You start seeing differentiation between that orange group and the examiner group, but not the parent group. Neither one of those groups gets differentiated from the orange group when you force definitions of disruptive behavior to come from both of the informants simultaneously, which does happen on occasion, but not often. Right? And so what did this first study teach us? Well, it taught us a few different things. What if, because one of the neat things about this kind of work is once you can understand that the patterns of subjective reports make sense, you don't necessarily need the observed behavior, that really time-intensive task to make good decisions. So what if you had these subjective ratings, which are fairly easy to collect, it takes about 20 minutes to collect from these parents and teachers. And the decision you have to make afterwards is not only who's disruptive, but where should I deliver the intervention? Because I can do an intervention to reduce a child's disruptive behavior, and it can happen based on what's happening in the home. It can be a school-based intervention. It can cut across both of those kinds of settings. It could be a more comprehensive intervention that incorporates changing behavior in both school and home settings. If I had this data, I could personalize care. I can come to a much better decision of figuring out where this intervention needs to be administered, right? With these data than without it. And especially with with these data, then just assuming, well, they're different. Does that mean the parent had a bad day? They're different. Does that mean the teacher was too stressed out to give me an accurate rating? Well, based on these data, within this sample, these discrepancies appear to reflect real phenomena. These discrepancies appear to contain useful information, even if you think to yourself, there's no way these subjective data are useful. Here's one example. Now, completely different developmental period, completely different assessment issue. When we assess adolescents for things like how anxious they are, how depressed they are, we know they're very difficult issues to see. We know it's useful to ask more than one person, but we also know that it's very difficult to see, and then we'll oftentimes, of course, ask the adolescent about their own concerns. These kinds of issues pose risk for the development of all kinds of concerns like substance use and suicide and a whole host of different kinds of severe manifestations of mental health concerns. Now, oftentimes, these are the kinds of concerns that might prompt a caregiver to seek out services that are really acute or intensive in nature on behalf of their adolescent. Because that's the thing about these mental health concerns, is that in many provinces, states, locations, it's not the adolescent seeking out care on their own behalf. It's a caregiver. It's somebody who has a legal authority over their or guardian over their well-being. Okay. Now, you might ask yourself, well, if you also ask for people's subjective impressions of adolescents' concerns here, and you're bringing this adolescent to a hospital setting where they're already giving you very clear evidence they pose an immediate danger or threat to themselves or others, shouldn't this be one of the rare places where everyone's on the same page? The answer to that is no. We see discrepancies in these assessments at about the same levels we see in a host of other assessment circumstances. That's the interesting thing. And the question there is, well, surely somebody's wrong there. And therefore, if they're wrong, it can't, at least their report can't be useful, can it? Well, it turns out that structure that I showed you earlier with the parents and teachers, some agree there's something there, some agree there isn't anything there, and they disagree but in different directions. You see that structure here too. Now, if someone is giving us bad data, if the adolescent's trolling us, or the parent is just overdoing it to get their to get somebody attention and it's not an accurate reflection of their concerns, we probably wouldn't be able to. We probably have a really hard time seeing structure in those data. That's one thing. Now, the interesting thing is, what does the structure help us understand and detect? Now, these assessments all occurred before admission, right? This was used as a decision point to figure out who should enter into the admission unit, who should get a bed, who's gonna be coming in here for 3 days. Those patterns I just showed you have clinical value. Here are a couple of examples. Those circumstances where the parent said, I see a high degree of internalizing issues here, a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression. And the adolescent says, no, I don't agree. It's not, there's nothing to see here, guys. Nothing to see here, guys. That adolescent was at increased risk of being administered sedatives while they were at the unit, presumably to decrease their aggressive behavior. That adolescent was really likely to be administered locked door seclusion. They were kept behind the door for a series of days without any contact with anybody else. Now, you're only doing those kinds of things when a client in an acute care setting is displaying behavior that falls way outside the norm of the unit, and you have to figure out a way to keep them safe and everyone around them safe as well, right? So we see these data and we say to ourselves, let's assume that the adolescent is trolling us. They are saying no, when in reality there is a lot. I wouldn't be able to detect this pattern without their bad data. Is the take-home message that we got from the book. Now imagine here too, just like the first study, collecting these data takes us less than 20 minutes. And at the end of those 20-minute period, if I'm able to figure out, okay, now I have a kid that's saying no to these issues, a parent that's saying yes to these issues, I got to help engage this kid in therapy. I have some work to do before they get here. I can't just admit them because they're going to pose an immediate danger threat to themselves or others while they're on leave. What can I do to help? Imagine if you had these data in front of you, the decisions you could make with them versus without them, or by saying, or even better, the decisions you can make with them, as opposed to just assuming, well, the adolescent's saying no, so the data is not useful. I'm just going to go ahead and tuck it away and pretend that it didn't collect it. One last example. Maybe these discrepant views reflect real stuff. Sometimes we're even able to use these data to forecast what something that takes a lot of time and effort to do might reveal. And then we're going back to social anxiety, staying in adolescence, focused on social anxiety. Now, one of the things I didn't mention about these clinical assessments for social anxiety is that yes, we might collect information from parents and adolescents and other kinds of figures. And yes, their reports disagree, but one of the things that we often see clinically, and this is intuitive, we say to ourselves, well, a parent's saying one thing, an adolescent's saying another thing. But I know that individuals who experience social anxiety often have a hard time disclosing negative stuff about themselves. They don't like being evaluated negatively. Not a fan. So is that what's going on here? Is this adolescent downplaying their concerns because they don't want to look good in front? They want to look bad in front of an unfamiliar person. Well, and we thought that's possible, but it warrants a thorough test because there's an alternative explanation I can have for those differences. It might reflect the fact that when adolescents rate their behavior, they're giving us a little bit of what's happening at the home and a little bit happening at school or in non-home settings. And parents are giving us something that's almost exclusively in school or exclusively in the home. So how do we reconcile that? Now we need another referee, just like we needed for the parent-teacher ratings. We need a referee. So how do you make one? Well, what we did was we said to ourselves, well, we know that we're getting good home stuff from the parent. So let's create a scenario in our assessment setting that allows us to simulate what happens in non-home settings, particularly those situations that we're pretty sure parents are not privy to, which is those times where adolescents are interacting with somebody their own age, but they're not friends yet. Parents might already see the kids that come home to hang out. Those are familiar. That's not what we're talking about here. A lot of the symptoms and impairments that manifest with these adolescents are manifesting with people they don't know yet, right? And they avoid that. They have an impairment. So what did we do? Well, it turns out that adolescents within the age of around 14, 15 years old, there are usually a fair amount of undergraduates at the University of Maryland that can pass for 14, 15-year-olds. So we created a series of scenarios in our assessment environment that allowed us to replicate interactions with an adolescent and somebody that they have yet to ever meet. And it's we call it the unfamiliar peer paradigm, and that QR code will take you to some information relevant to this. And there's just a series of clinical activities. So one of the things that we often do when we try to address an adolescent's needs related to social anxiety is we create practice sessions in therapy that allow them to get an idea of the way social situations might or might not pan out. And we use them in particular to sort of test what adolescent clients will expect from those situations. And usually when an adolescent experiences social anxiety concerns, they're thinking none of these situations are going to go well. I'm going to go to say hi to somebody and they're going to ignore me. I'm going to ask for directions at the mall. You know, remember we used to do that, go to the mall. I'm going to ask for directions and I'm going to be ignored there too. You know, things aren't going to go well. So these exposures, these practice sessions are designed to sort of allow people to test those assumptions. And the hope is that sometimes those assumptions are wrong. And that maybe the more adaptive way of thinking about these situations is that sometimes they might go wrong, but sometimes they might go just fine. And so these scenarios were sort of variations on that theme. We had adolescents sit down with somebody they thought was their own age, and we said, pretend it's your first day at school. Adolescents hate that. They hate it so much. That unfamiliarity, they do not like it. And they also don't like the ones with a whole lot of structure. So we also created situations where there were really structured scenarios. They were kind of awkward. They were like 10-second Wes Anderson films. You know, really awkward, really awkward. Imagine the Rushmore, but in my lab, and the acting isn't as good, but it's still good. It's still good acting. And then we had them give a speech. Give an impromptu speech where we gave them topics to discuss. You know, standard things that you see in exposure sessions. Although, to be fair, you might see the speech later on, much later on in therapy than you would see in the first few sessions. And I mentioned before, our adolescents, our fake peers, our unfamiliar peer confederates, are undergraduates at the university. They learn lines like an actor might. They learn these lines for a couple weeks. So they go to acting school, but they don't don't get any training in measurement. We don't teach them how to rate behavior. We want them to simulate what somebody around the age of the adolescent might rate them if they were like a lay person, kind of like a parent, right? So in fact, they complete the same survey measures the parent does, except instead of my child as the item stem, it's the participant. And then some people might say, well, come on, to what degree can you be confident the adolescents are thinking these people are actually the same age? And then to that, I might say, the current Spider-Man was 21, the first movie he did, and he's pretending to be a 15-year-old. So you could get carded at a bar and come in and get into the bar. Like even Spider-Man 1. And Tobey Maguire, the first of these Spider-Men, was 25, and Andrew Garfield was 28, pretending to be half his age. It's possible. We just have to do our due diligence to make sure that we're picking people who can pass as 15-year-olds. Now, the interesting thing is, what do the patterns of agreement look like with these ratings? I remember before I showed you, on average, low to moderate agreement, 0.28, right? Well, we see in our data some really interesting patterns. The parents and the adolescents, well, their ratings corresponded at about the level you'd expect. The parents and the peers, really low, like near 0. They couldn't see this adolescent more different if we told them to please rate purposefully how the other person might not rate you. Really different. Now here's the other interesting thing. Parents and the peers correlate near 0. Now the question you might ask yourself is, well, how do the adolescents and the peers do? Because you got a referee here. And so surely if the adolescents and the peers ratings are also kind of low, maybe that should call into question what the adolescent's rating. Well, it turns out their agreement rating was not only higher than the parent, it's higher than most circumstances where we try to assess kids. I mean, that rating is really, really high. It's kind of the rating that you'd expect to see from a mother and a father rating the same child, right? To give you a sense of the gauge, the meta-analytic data. And then upon further probing, we sort of asked the question, well, if the patterns of agreement look like that, well then how do these ratings behave from an accuracy standpoint? Well, we sort of asked the question, do they relate to other things that I know are good tools? Do they relate to how these kids actually behave in those environments I just showed you? Like when we get trained independent raters to make the ratings, not subjective ratings. And we learned all these ratings are doing something useful in their own way. Yeah, they're telling us something different, but they're doing all the things I would expect a precise, accurate tool to do. And that led us to a very interesting discovery. And it took us back to a paper that was about 20 years old. A really great statistician from Stanford, Helena Kramer, who's always right. Whenever you pose a question about something statistics related, Helena Kramer's always right. And she was right here too, and it took us about 20 years to realize it. What she said was, look, these disagreements happen all the time. But oftentimes when we're collecting this information, we might do what the journalist does and purposefully select information sources, but sometimes we're just selecting information sources just out of convenience, just because somebody is there. And her argument was we should never do that. We should never do that because the goal of these assessments should not be to get consensus. They shouldn't be to find the truth based on who's agreeing and who's not. We know these kids behave differently depending on where they are. So let's force disagreement to happen. And the metaphor she used was satellite position. So any of us who have a phone, who want to get to a restaurant, a grocery store, Walmart, the ability of us to use that phone to get from point A to point B is predicated on a bunch of satellites above us, triangulating on our position. And the triangulation is important. To get accurate location data from us in any one point requires not your favorite satellite, not all the satellites lumped in one position, but all satellites strategically placed at disparate points in space. And Kramer, in her brilliance, says, why aren't we doing that with information sources? That's what we have to do. We have to force this agreement to happen because the most accurate estimate of somebody's mental health status, rather than geographic location, is likely going to function on the same principles. Turns out she was right, at least in our sample, because when we start thinking about each of these information sources that I described to you as satellites, it turns out that characterizing their information this way allows us to get prediction to observed anxiety, observed internal experience at levels approaching 0.7, which none of us ever see when we use subjective data to predict observed behavior. When we use this, we're lucky to see the correlation at 0.1 or 0.15 or 0.2. We're starting to see prediction at levels we never expect to see, which then allows us to say to ourselves, if we can increase the precision even further, might we be able to get to a place where we can take the subjective data, which take us less than 10 minutes to complete, and then try to simulate or forecast what outcomes of assessments might be that take hours or days or weeks or months to complete. So a lot of the work that we do, the take-home message is the following: that a lot of these tools, these instruments that we use in the clinic, in research settings all over the world, are yielding the same kinds of patterns of agreement and disagreement, and we're not optimizing their utility to their fullest possible extent. We just rearrange some of the ways in which we think about these data, how we administer them, how we interpret them. We can ramp up and optimize their utility and really improve decision making and improve people's lives. Now, to go back to converging operations. So I just showed you a bunch of data that clearly violate key principles of Window-Garner's approach. And our solution for that was to develop a framework that expands upon Window-Garner's notion of converging operations into at least a few different circumstances. So obviously, there are some unique circumstances when you're assessing youth mental health, where you do see agreement. And I showed you that red group. That red group in that first study, there are parents and teachers whose patterns of agreement are tracking that consistency in that persistent display of behavior. People are seeing it across the board, but it doesn't happen often. And if it's one of those circumstances that doesn't characterize these patterns of reports to the fullest possible extent, that requires new concepts. And so in our framework, we have a notion that not all discrepant views are created equal. Some might be reflecting that useful information that I just showed you in the last few studies. Some might very well reflect the idea that an informant had a bad day, or I used the wrong tool, or I asked the wrong questions, or I used really bad response options. And those might very well be possible, but to the degree that you're using well-established instruments, you're removing a lot of that noise, that imprecision in the process. Right? And it's important to sort of distinguish one from the other, because you might use the data very differently if those discrepant reviews reflect this pattern rather than this pattern, and vice versa. And going back to the first few questions I asked you, I mean, I don't tend to think that youth mental health assessments are reflective of all the ways that people's views disagree from one another. I just happen to think it's a really good place, really good phenomenon to test these questions, because it happens often, and I can track it. I can track its stability over time. But then that also begs the question: are there ways to sort of learn from these kinds of phenomena as they manifest in youth mental health assessments? Start thinking about ways in which you can reconcile or learn from discrepant views in other contexts. What if you had referees, and what if you had people who held these discrepant views, who adhered to a standard? We see things differently. We want to come to a good decision, and I'm going to hold myself. Let's come to a consensus on at least a standard, a referee to judge by. And if we disagree for good reason, well, that's a reason for continued discussion and collaboration, and perhaps even mediation and compromise. But if one of us are trolling, but if one of us isn't being honest, if one of us is being an honest broker, the referee is going to tell us. So some of the things that are driving my thinking a whole lot now, and it has a lot to do again with converging operations, and it has to do with this idea that a lot of the ways in which we think about judging the accuracy of our instruments traces back from that notion that convergence equals truth. A lot of the ways in which we try to do that, at least in psychology. And I showed you a few different circumstances that clearly violate those assumptions. So how do we judge the accuracy of our instruments? Under those circumstances where convergence doesn't equal truth, that there are actually multiple perspectives on truth, and they're all telling us something useful about that truth. We have a paper under review that unpacks a new paradigm for judging accuracy, at least on psychological instruments. Here's the thing we struggle with is that our team, a host of other teams, look at these issues, And we're using psychological instruments that were developed in that world where convergence equals truth, where everyone should be asked the same questions, where everyone should be given the same response options, where nothing less than convergence signals some problem in accuracy of measurement. So we've been calling that whole notion into question. Are there some circumstances where we should be reimagining the way we think about developing psychological instruments? And in particular, trying to yoke the item content to those specific places where we know parents have expertise in observing behavior and teachers have expertise in judging behavior and what have you. So that's some of our current work funded by the U.S. Department of Education. Trying to figure out, is there a way to do this, way to tailor these instruments for the use of the people who complete them. And then the last thing, I showed you a bunch of examples of how you might make sense of these discrepant views in entire samples. And anyone here who's ever worked with psychological data know that yeah, samples are a great place to ask questions, but at the end of the day, a lot of us care about these data only insofar as they're giving us really good information about what's happening when you collect data with a single person, a single set of informants ratings about a single client. And because that's the stuff, the samples are the stuff of research. Working with individual clients is the stuff of care, of services. So how do we refine or think about these procedures and their relevance to working individually with clients? And those are things that are occupying our thinking now as well. So and the hope is that by going through the next steps in our work, we might be able to progress beyond thinking to ourselves that convergence equals truth, and perhaps think about truth as it might manifest in real life, in real social experiences where we know that there are multiple truths for any one way of thinking about social experience. Thank you for your time. I didn't mention this at the beginning. Whenever I do talks like these, I always come bearing gifts. So that QR code will take you to a Dropbox folder with all the articles that I mentioned and more in relation to the work that I discussed. Thank you so much for your time.